Hello, and welcome to the Home Care Handbook Series Part 1 webinar presented by Polsinelli. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand on our website within 48 hours. Please use the questions and support box to submit questions to our speakers throughout the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, please type your question in the questions and support box and our engineer will assist you. I would now like to turn the webinar over to Julio Barea, Vice President of Sales at Ally Care Time.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar. We're finally here. Today we're going to be covering the Home Care Series, Part 1, Overview of Compensable Time, presented by Angelo Spinola and the Polsinelli Law Firm. My name is Julio Barea, Vice President of Sales for Ally Care Time. We're a series of software companies that work with agencies and registries in this space. I've had the privilege of knowing Angelo for quite some time. Angelo Spinola has been an attorney and a shareholder for Polsinelli Law Firm, a top 100 in the country for over 20 years. And if you're in this space, in this business, you know him as well. I'm very proud and privileged to be here. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Angelo.
Thank you, Julio, and thank you, Polsinelli team, for getting this set up. This is going to be a really fun series, and I do say series because there are 3 that we're going to do, which will allow us to take a deep dive into some particular pay practices that haunt our industry. And we may be a top 100 law firm. I think it's like 64 by revenue or something, but in home care, we're number 1, baby. Number 1. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping things real quick. Q&A, use the Q&A feature to ask questions. There were some pre-submitted questions. They're great. A lot of them were on live-in. We're gonna do live-in, but it's not this, it's the second in the series where we really talk about live-in practices. I'll show you what we're going to be talking about today. But if you tell us what any other topics you want to hear about, specific questions you have, we're going to be moving pretty fast and furious today because we only have an hour. But we will get to as many questions as we can. So with that in mind, there's been questions, and there will always be questions in every webinar I've ever done. You know, is it being recorded? Do we get the slides? You will get the recording, not the slides. You will get the recording, so that you can listen to this and put yourself to sleep tomorrow night, the next night, whatever. Send it and share it with your team. So that's from my guy Vince. Vince, I miss your accent, man. I hope you're doing well. And then another question was about a sample per visit, pay per visit policy or travel time policy. Denise, if you are a Posh subscriber, Denise, you've got both of those. We'll cover that as we go. As Julio mentioned, my name is Angelo Spinola. I'm a shareholder at Polsinelli. I love this industry. I love working with you all. I love series like this because we can really educate and I think move the needle on compliance and really help you, and that's my intention. So I would ask you to do your best to not try to multitask and pay attention because of the way that we're going to move. And I know that somebody's going to say, well, what did you say? You know, what was that? And we'll get to it again, either after the presentation or through the recording. So what are we talking about? We're going to talk about first, what is compensable time? What is working time? How do you define it? All right, that's what we're going to be doing today, and covering some specifics like orientation, right? How does that apply to specific things like travel time and orientation? The next part of the series, which is going to be on May 14th, so mark your calendars now, May 14th at noon from 12 to 1, we're going to be going through the exemptions, right, and pay requirements and pay practices. That's when we'll hit the live-in issues. And then the last one, which will be at August 13th from 3 to 4, we're going to go through what you need to have in your handbook and specific policies, why they're there, why they're important. So please tune in for all of those. And again, you know, what a lot of times we see is the owner gets on the first one of these series, realizes that there's an office manager or somebody in your office that really could benefit from this, and either shares the recording or invites them to the next one. So, and all of these will be hosted on Posh. So I know I see the faces the names, don't see your faces. I will soon, though. I know all of our conferences are coming up, so I'll see you there. But I know many, I'd say, there's over 1,000 attendees today. 75% of them are Posh subscribers. So we'll be telling you where things are on Posh, and we'll be going through, when we go through the handbook series, a lot of that. But yeah, that's what we're doing today. You know the firm, I won't belabor it, but national firm, we do everything. It's the one-stop shop for the home care industry. That's who Polsinelli is. Let's get at it. Okay, work, what is it? It's actually not defined by the Fair Labor Standards Act, if you can believe that, right? It's not defined specifically, but what they do say are work-related activities, or activities that primarily benefit the employer, the agency, right, that are permitted, suffered or permitted is the operative word. That's considered working time that's compensable. So what's important to understand is that term suffered or permitted means if it's happening, if you're not monitoring it but allowing it. So we know requested or required work, right? We say you've got to be there, you got to do this, that we're going to be paying for that. But also, if somebody's independently doing something that we didn't specifically ask them to do, this comes up a lot in the context of, hey, we had 6 service hours and the person stayed a half hour later. We didn't ask them to do that, and they were cleaning up and talking to the client, taking care of the client. We don't want to pay them for that. Well, unfortunately, you do have to pay for that, regardless of whether you get reimbursed for it or not, or whether it was scheduled or not. And you can't eliminate that responsibility through policy, because it was allowed, it was permitted. So what do you have to do? You have to not permit that from happening. How do you do that? Well, stay tuned. That's why I said don't multitask, because got a lot of good nuggets for you. What if you don't actually specifically know, right, that somebody's working? Well, some of the scenarios that we see are, if you had reason to know, if there's it's called constructive knowledge in the law, right? If you had an idea that it was happening, so somebody goes away with care notes that aren't filled out, right? Or a visit, let's say it's home health and it's the visit note, right? And now all of a sudden it's submitted while they're off the clock, right? That's a problem, right? A supervisor's awareness or constructive awareness, you should have known, because somebody left with a pile of papers off the clock, came back with the pile of papers completed, they were working, right? You're going to have imputed knowledge there, and you will have to pay, right? Now, what is a work day, right? What is a work day? That's basically defined as whenever there is a principal activity, right? The first principal activity from the last principal activity. Principal activity meaning one that relates to the work that they perform, right? So think whistle to whistle in the old days, right? When the whistle starts and the person starts performing work, they're generally on the clock, absent an exception, and we're going to talk about some of the exceptions like meal breaks. Later in the series, we'll talk about sleep time, right? Where can you have a break in the action that isn't compensable, right? Unless there's an exception, it's a defined exception in the law. The idea is when that principal activity begins, you're paying them through until their last principal activity of the day. So that means that actual working time, since it's defined by what the person is doing and is it benefiting the employer, can be different than what you've scheduled. It can be different than what the service hours that have been approved by the government or the client. It can be different than that, and generally is. In fact, when we see service hours, we do a lot of diligence in transactional work. And when we see the caregiver pay record matching up perfectly with service hours, we know that that's a lie, right? We can say, as we're looking at the potential acquisition, oh, wow, 12 to 4 every single time, not a minute variation. That's not how people work. So somebody is monkeying with this and just tracking the service hours and the reimbursement hours, and that's a red flag. We need to investigate further. Now there's an issue with potentially with the sale of that business. So I also want you to think about, as we're thinking and walking through all of this, right? I'm a litigator, so I litigate cases all the time. I do the diligence work, do the labor diligence. but a lot of my focus is on preventing you. I've got an agency focus. How do we keep you out of hot water where you can focus on your operation and do do what you're trying to do, which is serve our elderly, serve our communities, right? What you do is God's work, and we want you focused on that and not having to deal with lawsuits and issues and regulatory problems, all that, right? So we want to clear that path. Part of that is educating you, but the flip side of it is, if you ever want to sell your business, these things that we're talking about have got to be cleaned up, and for the majority of you, they're not all the way cleaned up. I know this, you know this, right? The DOL knows this. The DOL has said that 89% of home care businesses are out of compliance when they investigate them, right? Generally due to a caregiver complaint or employee complaint. So we need to make sure that we're focused on this now, and we can clean these things up, in real time. Okay, so we're going to focus, a lot of questions where, hey, are you going to get into state law? At times I will, to use examples for you, but not comprehensively. There was a lot of questions about California. California's a very unique animal. We just did a full presentation with CASA that's on their site that you can get. We'll be at the CASA conference later this year, and we do California-specific presentations. I'll touch on California because it's often different than federal law, but it's not going to be the primary focus. The primary focus will be federal law with identification of where states may differ or may go further than federal law. One of those is minimum wage, right? The federal law, which is the FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, requires payment of minimum wage, which under the Fair Labor Standards Act is $7.25. Laughable, right? No caregivers getting $7.25. You wouldn't be able to hire anyone. A lot of the state minimum wages are a lot higher than that. They go up to $15, $16 in some locations, some cities, right? State, city. So there's a lot of different law, and what you have to do is whatever the minimum is that's most beneficial to the employee. You might go beyond that and pay more, but say in New York, where there's a minimum wage specific for caregivers that's higher than the minimum wage for other types of employees, you've got to pay that minimum wage because that's the law that is most beneficial to your employees. So that's kind of how you analyze it. You also have to pay overtime at the regular rate at time and a half under the FLSA. Time and a half, the regular rate, that's bolded for a reason. Once they work 40 hours. We know that in some states there's also state daily overtime requirements, like California, like Alaska, like Colorado for live-ins after 12-hour shifts, right? So we have to be mindful of the daily overtime as well. But for now, let's talk about the 40-hour requirement that applies to most of you, and the payment of overtime at the regular rate. This is one of the areas that is often missed, right? Is what does that mean? Regular rate is different than hourly rate, right? Regular rate includes all other types of non-discretionary payments like bonuses, commissions, on-call premiums. It typically does not include things like PTO reimbursements or expense reimbursements. So cell phone expense reimbursements, for those of you who have to do that, mileage, that wouldn't count towards the regular rate. But if you're paying an on-call premium, if you're paying a bonus that's earned, like a production bonus or an attendance bonus or something like that, or you're providing gift cards to people that have an economic value to them, right, for their performance, the value of that, the amount of the bonus, all of that has to be factored into the regular rate. So that's typically higher than the hourly rate. And this is something that is missed often, right, where we're not including the on-call premium in our overtime calculation. So what that effectively means is that we are underpaying overtime, and that's something that the DOL looks at with great frequency. So here are some of the areas where there are compensable hours and time, right? So twofold, right? One, what's included in the regular rate. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a working hour. So for example, an on-call premium or a bonus can be paid without anybody actually working on call, just for being on call. That's not going to constitute working time, but it is compensation that must be in the regular rate. Then you have activities that may be considered working time that have to be counted as working time. Why? Because it was something done, activities performed for the benefit of the employer that were suffered or permitted. Remember that? So pre and post shift time, preparation work, right? I'm going to just review my care notes before I go and see the client, right? As a caregiver, a non-exempt caregiver, that's working time that must be paid. Lots of training time. We're going to get into that today. Trainings and meetings that are work-related, orientation, travel time, working from home. Those types of things are considered work that have to be paid. I'm loving it. I'm seeing. I can't look just yet, but I'm seeing lots of questions coming in. So that's great. Keep them coming. So where are the areas where I told you I litigate, right? So where am I litigating? It is these kind of things. Meal breaks, mileage, right? Travel time especially, right? Where we see, I'm going to pay mileage, but not travel time. We're going to get into that today. Failure to reimburse mileage, either for minimum wage workers or states that require you to pay mileage in addition to the travel time. It's not an either or. It's a both and in some states, and then in other states, it's just the travel time. And I'll actually show you, I've got a slide, I believe, that tells you which ones are which. Improper time edits, manipulation of pay rates is a huge one. We're going to get into that in, I think, the second part of the series, where we've got all these different rates for these different types of work activities, and we'll incentivize people for a 2-hour visit or a 4-hour visit, right, by paying them more, and then maybe reduce the pay for long hour visits. Sometimes we see shifting rates for live-in, right, where the rate will change depending on the number of shifts. Sometimes that can be considered rate manipulation, where we're depressing the overtime rate by depressing the hourly rate paid. Delays in payment. Hey, if you don't turn in your notes, you're not going to get paid. If you don't do X, Y, and Z, you're not going to get paid. But we're in a state that has a deadline, right, of when you have to pay people. Not paying for, and I'll just say this in general, right, this kind of idea of non-productive time or time that isn't reimbursable to the agency is a huge one, right? And one of example of that is orientation time. So we're going to kind of talk about that, right? We're going to talk about these sort of issues. So orientation time, do you have to pay for orientation time? That a non-exempt meaning they're not, and they don't have an exemption from overtime. So most of your caregivers are going to qualify for that. If you're home health, RNs, PTs, OTs may not qualify. We're going to do the exemptions on the next one of these and talk about when somebody's exempt from overtime or not. But right now we're talking about hourly non-exempt employees, right? When you are orienting them and you're talking to them about your individual policies and procedures, your handbooks, your expectations, what their job duties are, that's time that is compensable. And it's very difficult to argue that, well, we haven't hired them yet. We're orienting them, but they're not in our payroll yet. So it's really pre-hire. That's not how it works. What the law looks at is what are they doing specifically, right? And there is a distinction between what we refer to as pre-hire paperwork and substantive, training on the job, hands-on training about your business. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But I do want to explain that you can pay orientation time at a different rate than somebody's service rate. And that's true for orientation, that's true for discipline, for trainings, for travel. You can have a base rate that you pay for service hours, and it can go up from there, right? If it's couples care or something else, an unfavorable shift or weekend shift, something like that, you can increase that. We'll talk about how to communicate that to a caregiver. But for your non-productive time, you can treat that all at minimum wage. You should pay at least minimum wage, and you should identify that in your offer letter. And this is an example of one in California where we do it. The other thing, and this is probably a little small for you because it's small for me and a little fuzzy, sorry about that. But one of the things that we do around rate manipulation is to make sure it's clear that, hey, you have a base rate. There may be a different rate, like a minimum wage rate for non-productive time, and your rate may change, and here are the reasons why it would change. Might change due to reimbursement, favorable shift, the difficulty in getting the shift assigned, right? It might be because it's weekend, right? There's a lot of reasons that your rate may be different, and this is directly off of POSH. Every state has one of these offer letters, right? But it's not going to be based on the number of hours that you worked, right? It's not going to be designed, your rate changes aren't going to be designed to deflate your overtime compensation, right? We say that's, completely clear, right? Very, very clear. So I'm going to paraphrase because the questions are coming in so fast, they're bouncing off. But I know what you're asking because you ask the same things every time, not the same people, right? But agencies. Well, we're designated as an orientation or a feeling out period, right? So we're telling them it's not paid time, and they're in a temporary spot, and we'll pay them, and maybe we'll even pay them the orientation once they take on an assignment. But our problem is we go and orient these caregivers, then we finally have something for them to do. We've got a patient to assign them to, and they ghost us, so we don't want to pay them until they actually start working and they create value for us, or we want to hold that payment. That's still a risk for you. In some states, it's more of a risk than others if you're withholding payment. I will tell you this, my role, I'm not going to tell you to do this, but my role is to help you triage what your risks are. And if you've got a strong arbitration program where they've signed arbitration, this one isn't that high on my radar where somebody ghosts you and you haven't paid them orientation, but you were planning to pay it to them at the time they start working, right? That's not one that I will beat you up on. Is it a technical violation of the law? Yes, it is, especially in some states where there are timing requirements of when you must pay. Do I see that issue litigated a lot? No, I don't, especially when it's a one-off, not a class action. That's what the arbitration agreement is about, is you want to protect yourself from class actions where anything, like rounding is another great example. People say, well, should I round? Can I round to the nearest 5 minutes, 15 minutes, right? Ideally, no. In California, definitely no, right? But if you're going to round and you have arbitration, right, and you're rounding evenly, meaning that the rule is a neutral rule, that's much, much less of a risk than if you don't have an arbitration program, because now those little increments of time where, oh, well, you rounded and I lost 3 hours of work over the course of a year, that's not a big deal if it's brought by an individual caregiver. If it's brought by 100 caregivers, it's a big deal, and it adds up, and now all of a sudden, believe it or not, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it makes a difference. Okay. I really need to move faster. Sorry, guys. So unpaid orientation. Let's just touch on this real quick, right? Pre-hire paperwork, filling out an application, a basic competency test, tax forms, all of that. You can separate those out from paid orientation time, right? And you can kind of have them do that in advance, and that generally is not compensable, right? It's when it's specific to the employer, right? When it's training them how to do their job that it becomes paid. Now, a lot of people ask, well, what about, and there are some state laws, right? Like this is an example to just prove the point in Utah, where at the end here it says employment orientation meetings very likely fall within this definition, and this definition is compensable time, right? So just be aware that in general, orientation is going to be compensable, and if you are treating it as though it isn't, you want to make sure that you've got an opinion on that and a way of documenting this, that it is in fact compliant, because the assumption is going to be that it's compensable. The same is true of travel time, of training time. So this one trips up a lot of people. You have your lunch and learns. Hey, you can come. It's not mandatory. It's optional. You come and learn about Hoyer lifts. We've got somebody that's going to come present about Hoyer lifts. We're going to supply you lunch, right? It's an hour. Do we have to pay for that? The answer is, in the middle of the day, almost always. Why? Because it's attendance that's voluntary is one aspect of it, right? For training time not to be compensable, these are the things that have to be satisfied. That it's voluntary, in other words, we're not making them come. That it's outside of regular working hours, so lunch and learn is not, is it, right? That's during your work day. And then here's the one that's really difficult for you. The course, lecture, or meeting is not directly related to the employee's job. Well, why would you be training anybody on something that isn't related to their job, right? Very rarely does that happen. And the employee does not perform any productive work, other work. For me, right, in law, sometimes we have CPR classes at night, right? That's just for your own benefit, maybe for your children, just for your overall education. I'm not generally saving anybody's life with CPR. It's only when they see my invoice where I have to do something like that. That's a joke, people. That's a joke. Just making sure you're paying attention. That I never have to do CPR. So that's for my benefit, the paralegal's benefits, right? Our choice, we want to be there. That's different for you. Even if you were having a CPR class for caregivers at night, right? So you're hitting everything else that is related to the job of a caregiver, right? That's going to be useful to them and helpful, so that's compensable. Now, I know what you're asking. Well, what about when they need to do it for their own credentialing, right? And their own requirements. That is possible, right? This is the FLSA law, right? If you need it, if it's the employees initiative and it's related to like a school and a program that isn't specific to the business, that can at times be non-compensable. At a state level, there are also exceptions, right? When it's a credentialing that is necessary for the employee. It travels with the employee regardless of where the employee works, and that is state specific. So what I would tell you about credentialing and training time, you see here how state specific it is before you make a determination not to pay for training time, get an opinion on that. And then there's a process we put in place. We have, for example, I think, we've got, here's the POSH policy, and I'll kind of talk about how we approach it is one. So example, I know there's a lot of franchisees on here. Your franchisor provides for you, and the caregivers may provide training modules, let's say from Care Academy or Navon or somebody like that, right? Caregiver gets on you don't tell them to, they just get on there, and I've had this case actually several times. The caregiver over the weekend does a bunch of courses because they're interested in improving their skill set. And then they come to you and say, oh, yeah, I did 10 hours of courses this weekend, and I had already done 40 hours of regular work for you. You owe me 10 hours of overtime. That caregiver would be right. They're correct. And a lot of people are like, wait a minute, I didn't tell them to do it. I didn't ask them to do it. Remember, suffer or permit, right? Remember that standard. If it's allowed, right? If they have access to it, that's another way of looking at it. There's a lot of systems out there, right? Where your EMRs and other systems where the caregiver can get to work-related things, care notes, things like that, without being clocked in. And if they're doing that and looking at things without being clocked in, you would owe them money, right, for the whatever time they spent looking at those notes. A lot of folks, again, don't realize that because your focus is on, well, what am I asking them to do? And what this is doing is it is shifting gears where now the employer really has responsibility for what the caregiver or the non-exempt worker does. And that's really hard and people don't like it, but that is the law. And that's why you see so many of these lawsuits filed. That's why we're constantly defending lawsuits in home care. It's really tough for you. You've got a remote workforce, right? You've got a ton of state law. You got a ton of industry specific law, like domestic worker bill of rights at a state and a city level, right? That law is constantly changing. And it's your obligation to make sure that the caregivers are doing it right, right? And you don't know half the rules, and the ones you do know, you're having a hard time getting them to enforce. What I would tell you is there are ways to do this, right? There are ways to handle this, and part of it is putting the burden back on the employee, right? And saying, hey, and it's through policy and procedure. So let me go back to the training time. What can we do about that? Well, we can have a policy that says, hey, you can't do any of those modules until and unless you've confirmed it with me, the owner. I want you have to get approval from me, right? And now let's say it's one of these state programs or something that isn't compensable because it's from, for example, third parties, right, that the caregiver takes with them and is mandated for their license, like a CNA, right? That when I say takes with them, they need it for any agency they work for. Sometimes that can be treated as non-compensable, right? Depending on your state, we want them to sign an acknowledgement, right? They want the caregiver to say, I understand I'm not getting paid for this. I'm doing this primarily for my benefit and not my employer's benefit. That's the key. So we're going to have an acknowledgement, and yes, those are on POSH, right? So implement those. And now if the caregiver does something like that or tries to sue you, we are prepared and ready, right, to defend that case. But where we run into a problem often, right, and that's why this session is focused on these aspects: orientation, training, right, travel. This is time you're not getting paid for generally as an agency. So there's a reluctance to pay the caregiver. And then what happens is the caregiver complains and sues, brings a class action. The DOL comes in, right, and investigates. And now we have a violation and we owe a ton of money. It's not just the travel time that wasn't paid. It's not just the training time that wasn't paid. Under federal law, it's generally going to be double that at minimum, plus all the attorney's fees. And those are my attorney's fees for defending you and the attorney's fees of the attorney that brought the case. So you're looking at 4 or 5 times the cost of just paying this time, right? And that's federal law. State law, as you in California know, that could be 10, 12 times because you have treble damages, you've got penalties, right? It's outrageous. So you really, really need to pay attention to getting this right in the first place and creating evidence and documentation to defend yourself. It does not mean that you will never have an issue with compliance, right? If you have a policy that says, you must record your travel time and a worker doesn't do it, and you're telling them exactly how to do it and where to document it and all that, and you're reminding them and doing your part and they don't do it, right? We now have a defense. And so what we're building with your handbooks and your offer letters, and this is actually touches on a pre-submitted question somebody asked, hey, is it worth it to get an attorney? You're going to think this is self-serving, right? Is it worth it? Whoa, I don't know what just happened there. Somebody's all excited about the travel time. Just a minute. That might be Julio with a heavy finger there. I doubt it. I'm just messing with you, Julio. Should we have a curated handbook for our business, or can we just use a template? Right? Can we just use something that we get from an HR vendor? You really need a curated handbook, right? You need one that's industry specific. If you're a franchisee, it should be dealing with joint employment issues, all the state issues, right? And we do that. Yeah, I do a bunch of that. POSH has those on them, right? And those are templates, but they're templates for home care agencies in the state you're in, right? There's 51 of them, right? That's what you need, because it has the travel policies. It's got the off-the-clock work policies. It defines what work is, right? From a caregiver's perspective. What is the most common thing that we hear as an excuse? as to why time wasn't recorded. I didn't know that was working. I didn't realize that by looking at my care notes that I could get paid for that. Nobody ever told me that. It's right there in your handbook. And we tell you exactly what to do, who to report to, right? If anybody's instructing you not to record that. So you can't say somebody told me I can't put that in, or I can only work 40 hours. Well, if that happened, here's the number you called. Did you call that number, right? And that's what I mean by shifting some of that burden over the employee. Right now, most agencies are sitting ducks for these things, right? We get the case and we start working on settling the case because there's a violation, or not necessarily a violation, a lack of visibility. We don't know the answer. Live-in, great example. Did they have interrupted sleep time? We don't know. We didn't record it. We didn't track it, right? What's the term? Whatever is not measured is not something, right? That one. You know what I'm talking about. We have to measure it. We have to examine it. We have that responsibility. We have to have that mindset that we need to be responsible. And when there's a gap where we can't see what's going on, then we have a problem, right? Because now we are vulnerable, because we have to see as the employer, we have to know. All right, let's jump into travel now, and kind of go through this quickly. Hopefully everybody knows this part, right? Remember we talked about the first principal activity of the day, right? So if somebody has not done any kind of first principal activity of the day, right? And they just leave their home and go to their first assignment, their first client, and that's within an ordinary commute, it's not extraordinary, like 2 hours away, then that time's typically not compensable. And when they leave the last client and go home, that time's typically not compensable. All travel in between in a day's work is compensable and must be paid, right? All time in a day's work. And that means even if there are visits, and I'm going to show you an example of this, right, that are spaced apart by several hours, right? You still have to pay for that, and I'll show you a specific example. Everybody can still hear me, right? I see something that said something about my feed being gone. Am I still good? Okay. All right. So if you're driving a client, right, a caregiver's driving a client somewhere, whether it's in the caregiver's car or the client's car, that's always compensable time, right? That is work independently of the type of travel it is. That's always compensable time. On POSH, you've got agreements for that, both agreements that are caregiver facing and client facing. It's really important that you have an agreement in place if you're going to do that, because there's a lot of liability associated with accidents and things like that. All right, here's the one that trips everybody up, right? If there's a gap between two visits in the same day, you don't have to pay for downtime in between those visits, as long as it's enough downtime. At a minimum, our recommendation is an hour of downtime, right? At a minimum, it's got to be at least 30 minutes. That's really questionable. An hour is going to be safe if there's an hour of downtime. But that does not mean that you don't have to pay for any travel time. And look at this example. You still have to pay for travel time that would have occurred directly if a client went from caregiver A to B, right? And this, what this example is, it's basically showing that one visit ends at 11:30, the next one starts at 2, and they're 30 minutes apart, and the DOL is saying you got to pay for that 30 minutes. You don't have to pay for the 2 hours where the caregiver was going to Target and having lunch and not doing anything work related, but you do have to pay for that 30 minutes. And what a lot of agencies do, and this is a significant one, okay? When I was telling you orientation, we don't see a lot of orientation. We see a whole lot of travel, right? Either, oh, well, I was paying mileage and not travel. I thought the mileage would be sufficient. No. Or I pay for travel as long as the visits are within an hour of each other. But if they're longer than an hour or 2 hours apart, we ignore all travel time in a day's work. No. All those things are not lawful, and all those things are litigated a lot. And it's a great class action for these lawyers to bring, right? Because it's easy to prove. You've got records. You can demonstrate that it's not working. This is the rule of thumb that I just explained, that you want to try to leave an hour right, of downtime to treat that time as non-compensable or unpaid. I believe there was a question that came through real quick about what if it's the same client, right? You're coming back and forth the same client, so there is no travel in between clients. There might be travel because maybe it's a split shift where, and remember, some states have split shift premiums that have to be paid, like California in a situation like this, but it's only client A, client Smith, and the caregiver sees client Smith during morning hours and evening hours, so 9 to, let's say, 8 to 11, and then 3 to 6, and that's it. I don't believe there's travel time. There's no specific authority on that. I don't believe there's travel time required because that caregiver could go anywhere. There's no travel between clients. I don't think that hits it. I've talked to the DOL about it before, and they have agreed with me, but would not agree to put that in writing. So I think that we're on pretty safe ground there, although it's not set in stone. This is one of the ones that is really important, right? Really important. What caregivers are arguing these days, and it's been for the last few years, is that their home is really, they start work in their home because their home is like their office. First principal activity occurred in their home. Their initial commute, right? The home health guys will say, well, we went home, go home, and then release our notes, and that was a requirement that we release our notes, and so that now is compensable time. Not true. That's something, whether it's true or not, whether they're doing that or not, right? If we can't prove it, that they're not doing that and not performing that work, we are at risk for paying that first and last commute, which is really, really expensive. When you look at those kind of cases, those are typically millions of dollars because you're looking at 15, 20, 30 minutes each way every day. So an extra hour a day, 5 hours a week across, many caregivers over the course, and then double that at a minimum, and then put attorney's fees on top of it. That gets really, really expensive. So it's really important. Somebody asked about travel. Go ahead, you guys that don't want posh, go ahead and take a picture. That's not all of it, but you get some of it. This is the language that's really important. Non-exempt employers are not expected to accept or make calls or complete any paperwork before they begin their commute or after they finish their commute. That language, as long as you're following that language, is enough to blow up the claim I just talked about. And this also answers the question about, do we need a curated handbook? This is why. You don't have this in your handbook. Unless you're working with us or you're a POS subscriber, you don't have a travel time policy in your handbook, right? It's very rare that anybody does because it's not an issue that affects the general workforce. It's an issue that affects caregivers, right? And home care. Not just us, but just select industries. That was born, we designed that policy based on years of litigating the same issue, saying, hey, we need to put a stop to this and create a silver bullet to travel claims. So that one line, that little paragraph, can save you millions of dollars, literally, and all of the things that we develop have those kind of Easter eggs built in, evidence to support your agency that you may not even be aware of. So let's get to the question of business expenses. Look here, it's these states, right, that are light blue or pink, right, that have business expense reimbursement laws of some kind. And this may mean you have to look at the specific law, but it may mean, like in the case of California or Massachusetts or Illinois, that you have to pay not only the travel time, but also the mileage, because you have to reimburse for mileage, okay? So that's not an either or, it's travel and mileage. And mileage, the reimbursement of mileage can never substitute for the payment of travel time, right? You're always going to have to pay that travel time according to the rules that I provided. That's federal law, so that applies to everybody on this call, right? And you can't substitute mileage for it. You can pay, and this is an opinion letter we actually got. My team worked on this one, and the question was, do you always have to pay, if you're going to pay mileage, you always have to pay at the IRS rate? And the answer is no, right? And in fact, the IRS rate is the highest mileage rate, right, that you would have to pay. If you pay anything higher than that, it's no longer considered a business expense reimbursement. It's considered wages, anything over that currently 67 cents. But there's a lot of other fixed expenses in the IRS rate, right? Like these things, vehicle registration and fees and things like that, that don't have to be included in the rate that you reimburse for, right? So you do have to have a good methodology for it, and there are aggregators and vendors that help to do this. Also, keep in mind that typically caregivers drive cars that are not as valuable, right? When you're thinking about these factors that are included in the IRS rate, like insurance and sales tax, right? Their rates are lower than that, and you don't have to include those things in the first place. So what you would need is before you just say, well, I had this case too for a home care system in Massachusetts where they're paying a lower rate. This is actually what caused us to go get the opinion letter. Same thing as the travel policy. Like, man, our clients keep getting hammered on mileage reimbursement. We know that there's alternatives to the IRS rate, but nonetheless, we're litigating this case over and over again. Let's get the DOL to validate what we know and put it all in one place. And those cases, we've saved businesses millions and millions of dollars, millions, because many of those cases have gone away as a result of this opinion letter. You still have to know about the opinion letter to be able to use it, and you have to implement this reasonable methodology, right? Where you're saying, okay, we believe this is the cost, and we can talk if anybody wants to learn more about that. We can talk about it. Let me show you quickly how you, I'm gonna need a sip of water, man. I'm hot and my voice is parched. I'm going fast. Julio, we gotta do these in an hour and a half. We gotta do them in an hour and a half to get all the juice in it. Travel time policy, right? You can find them, right? And what the travel time laws in your state on the POSH employment guide, right? I mentioned that Illinois, for example, has a requirement to pay for mileage, right? So if you are an Illinois subscriber, then you would have the policy that's relevant to Illinois. You would have a full handbook, but if you, instead of wanting the handbook, maybe you have your own handbook and you just want to use the policies, then you can do that. And here's the example of a handbook. This is California. California also has a mileage requirement. So you see that, in addition to the expense reimbursement, we talk about mileage and drive time and talk about those travel time obligations. So sometimes there's a state component to the laws that we're talking about. All right, let's hit meal and rest breaks. And then I think we'll be close to wrapped. So we're gonna be on time here. Questions that we don't get to, we will get to them. I will try to follow up with you after the fact. And I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer to answer some questions for those of you who would like to stick around. All right, meal breaks. There is no federal law that requires provision of a meal break, believe it or not. It's not a requirement that you have to do that. That is state law. Some states are the ones that require you to provide meal breaks. There are oftentimes, see if I actually have a slide, but it might not be in here, that identifies the states with meal break requirements. But even in those states, sometimes there are exemptions to the general state law, like California and personal attendants, right? You don't have to provide meal and rest breaks for a caregiver under work order 15 that would qualify as a personal attendant, right? So you really have to understand your state laws here. But in general, meal breaks, when you have to provide meal breaks, really create issues for home care businesses, because it's really hard for you to get a caregiver to stop and take a 30-minute break, which is what it has to be for it to be unpaid, right, in the middle of the workday out in the field when you're not monitoring them. So the general rule from my perspective is, if you're not in a state that requires you to provide a meal break, then don't do it. Don't mandate that they take meal. They can if they want to, right? And if it's longer than 30 minutes, they can clock out and clock back in for it, right? But I would not try to mandate. If you are, though, in a state where meal breaks are required, right, then you really have to monitor and make sure that the meal breaks are being taken. So, for example, for those non-exempt, non-personal attendants in California, they've got to take a break within 5 hours of the start of their shift, right? And you've got to establish that they've taken that break. And if you can't do that, if they are either not offered a break or not taking the break, that, you know, as long as you're offering them in California, you'll be good. In Washington, they have to take the break. They have to take it. You have to demonstrate that they've taken the break. And if you can't do that, not only do you pay for the missed meal break, but you also pay an additional hour, right, penalty, right, for missing at their regular rate. So it's a pretty significant thing when you're not complying with the meal break rules. What I was saying here is that even if, right, we see this a lot where an employee says, well, let's call it a pre-shift work, right? They come in before their shift starts and don't clock in, or they just go to their desk and they're sitting at their desk, right? For, let's say, your non-exempt office staff, right? Even if they're doing that voluntarily and they're sitting here and they're like, look, I just want to stay at my desk and I'm going to surf the net and eat for 20 minutes. Well, number one, that's not long enough for it to be not compensable. It has to be 30 minutes. Two, if they're at their desk, they're going to get an email, they're going to respond to something, the phone's going to ring. It's just rife with problems, right? It's rife with issues. And the fact that the worker is volunteering to come in early, hey, I'm just getting organized for the day. I'm just going to come in, get my desk set up, respond to a couple emails, and I'll clock in at 9 when you want me to, and we don't need to worry about it. Not true. Right? We've got to pay them for that time. All right, next one that I want to touch on is rest breaks. I know I covered that quickly. Rest breaks. Again, federal law does not require rest breaks. Some states, however, do require rest breaks in the same kind of way after a certain number of hours when they're, and these are normally paid, right? The states that require rest breaks, you're still paying the worker, right? How does that square with live-ins and one-on-one care, right? There are waivers in a lot of states where you can say, hey, you know, we are required to provide you a meal break, but this job is not suitable for meals because you really can't leave the client unattended. And if you can't leave the client unattended, then you're pretty much on call, right? And we've got to pay you. And we'll talk about that again when we get into the live-in stuff on the next one. But we would like you to sign a waiver if you want this job and you're comfortable just eating on the job and getting paid for it. Sign this waiver, right? And then that can help us, right? So you just, again, have to know your state law. But with rest breaks, this is where we see a lot of problems. We've seen this in hospitals a lot, for example. You can't, if somebody does take a break, let's say they're a smoker and they clock out, right? Because in a hospital, you know, for workers' comp reasons, right, and liability reasons, they'll ask you, if you leave the facility, even if you step outside, clock out, right? I've had this case, big class action, all over the country, actually, for many hospital systems. Clock out, go smoke for 15 minutes, clock back in, and then that 15 minutes isn't paid. That has to be paid. That's not, remember the continuous workday? The break, a non-meal break has to be at least 20 minutes for it not to be counted as work, right? You don't pay somebody, fail to pay somebody who is working when they get up and go to the bathroom or get a cup of water, right? That's the continuous work days. We're not going to try to measure you minute for minute. It has to be a significant break, right, of 20 minutes or more for it to be treated as non-compensable. So be careful about people taking short breaks and clocking out and in, and your system really should ignore anything that's less than 20 minutes, even if they've clocked out and in, so we can see. That's what we did in the hospitals. We can see that the break was taken, but we're not going to charge you for it, right? We're not going to dock your pay for it. I did have this, so okay, good. I like to put this in here so you have an idea whether your state has meal break requirements or not. Okay. All right, and of course we have a great meal and rest break policy on Posh. Okay, putting it all together, I've only got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to do this quickly. Just from a compliance perspective, remember that the presumption is that unless you can prove that they're not working, that they're working, unless you can prove that they're exempt, they're entitled to minimum wage and overtime, right? The burdens are on you. No employee can waive their right to overtime or minimum wage. So somebody can agree with you today, just pay me straight time for all my overtime hours, and that's good enough, and I'll sign a waiver and sue you tomorrow and win, right? They can. And you want to make sure that all these rules and these policies and these things that you're going to put in place after listening to us today, right, that you're training people on it, starting with your managers, and they understand these rules. What is working time? How do they report their time? What happens if they're not paid the right way? What do they do? Who do they report to, right? All of these things. If they have a missed meal break, right, who do they report to? We want them communicating with you. We want them to have an open door within your organization so that they don't go outside to lawyers in the Department of Labor and others, right? So your program, it starts with your policies and your handbook, right? It is more critical than ever that you have a really strong backbone, and that's the policies. Areas, the assumptions are areas where you can't see into, you don't have visibility into what is happening with your employees, whether they're working or not. We need to get rid of those, and we need to make sure that so the idea of I worked 8 hours, I'm just going to tell you 8, or we're going to pay you at exception time, we're going to pay you 8 unless you tell us differently. That's not a good timekeeping system. That's why we're seeing EVV and all of these things implemented. We want to know where you are, where you said you were, whether you're working or not, right? Really critical. Having a really strong complaint and investigation process, right? With those internal complaints, training, starting with your managers and then the caregivers, auditing to make sure that indeed what we say we're doing or what our policies are, in fact, living, breathing, working, right? That it's not just window dressing, it's what we do, and then disciplining when we find errors, right? First education, and then when people should know better, discipline, and then your arbitration agreement, absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. It's your number one defense in this industry with all the class actions. In every single state, you can avoid a class action lawsuit on all the things that we just talked about: travel, orientation, live-in, all these pay practices with an arbitration agreement. They still have a claim, they can still bring the claim, but it's an individual claim and not a class claim. Absolutely critical. Still valuable. The one state is California, where there are PAGA class actions. Still extremely valuable to have an arbitration agreement. You just need to have one that is specific to California. All right, I think I've covered these things about training, expectations. Very quickly on Posh, I believe that most of you are subscribers. If you're not, you want to learn more about it, we have the arbitration programs, the guidance, the handbooks, all the state-specific materials. If you are interested, if you already subscribe, you don't have to respond to the poll. And there's also, I'm going to just tell you that, have I launched this poll? I'm not 100% sure how to do this. Somebody vote, one person vote. Okay, all right, so I have launched the poll. All right, I wanted to make sure. If you are a subscriber already and you just need a, to learn more about it, what are my credentials? What are my resources? There's another option here, right? We do a bi-weekly demo, and a lot of times those are navigational demos. But if you don't know about Posh and you just want a demo of it, then respond to the poll, and we will reach out and show you more and show you what resources we have in your state and all that good stuff. So let me leave that open for another second, and then we will move on. Got 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, launch. Okay. Now, if you are interested in care time and learning more about the products that Julio mentioned, then this is your poll. So I'm going to leave this open. Julio, if you want to say anything about this while the poll is open, please feel free.
No, fantastic. At first, I have to say I had the under, and you making it through in an hour. I'm very impressed. That was really.
I mean, I'm sweating over here. I'm telling you, it doesn't help that it's hot in my office, but I am sweating over here big time.
Folks, we'd love for you to answer the poll. Allied Care Time, we deal with issues like these every day. We definitely highly recommend working with Polsinelli, and we think the Posh subscription service is one of the best, if not one of the best thing that we've seen in the home care business. But please fill out the poll. We'd love to chat with you. If you have questions, we feel we can help.
All right, we'll do the same countdown. We're right at time, and then I think we can answer a couple of questions. If you have to go, understood. Please don't feel like you have to stay for it. We are recording this, so you can also listen to it later. But I do want to try to answer what we can. And I haven't looked at these questions yet, so this may be a little disjointed for a second. But let's do maybe 3 questions. All right, poll ends in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off. Oh, there's one more. Do you want to know about Care Time that takes care of all the? I'll leave that open while I do the question. Okay, so let's see here. Allow for arbitration agreements. Glad you asked that question because this comes up often. Okay, we've seen California try to do this several times. We've seen New York try to do it. Having the right arbitration agreement will trump the state laws. So liberal states sometimes try to eliminate the ability to use arbitration agreements, and they're not effective. So if you were to draw if your arbitration agreement was drawing on state law, right, and that was the operating force behind it, then you're right that if there's a state law that prohibits arbitration, that agreement will not work. However, if you're drawing on the Federal Arbitration Act, which is federal law, that will preempt or trump any contradictory state law. So really important that you have the right agreement. The agreement also should be retroactive. It should apply retroactively, right? So if an employee signs it today, it applies across all the other time that for the right claims. There are certain claims that can't be arbitrated, like sexual assault, sexual harassment, workers' compensation, those kind of claims. But those are all carved out of the agreement we provide. This, by the way, is if you want to just join one of the standing demos, right? So you already have Posh, but you need to learn more about it, or you don't want the spotlight of a one-on-one demo, join the masses on Wednesdays at 2:30 to 3 with that QR code. All right, here's another question. If your employee chooses to walk from one client to another client, does that travel time have to be paid for the travel time to walk versus to drive? That's a great question, and generally, yes. Like if that's how the person is getting there. We see this a lot in New York and places with public transit, where the time on a public bus system or something like that is more. That's the time you have to pay because that's how the caregiver is getting there. You can though tell the caregiver, listen, if you want to walk, like get the caregiver on this scenario, if the caregiver is able to drive or there's alternative transportation to get them there and they're spending, let's say, 40 minutes on something that should take 5, to me that would be an exception, and we could get an acknowledgement that that's not for the employer's best interest. That's the caregiver's interest in their health or whatever reason that they do it, and therefore it should be compensable, right? And get the caregiver to acknowledge that in writing, and I'd be comfortable with that. But let's say a car breaks down or something like that and they're walking, you would pay them for that time. All right, next question. Where's the Posh employment guide that I'm talking about? So if you go to your state resources on Posh and you click on, I think it's literally, actually you don't even have to go in state resources. It's right on the cover page. You will see state employment guide, a little tab for it. And you just click on that and they're all in there. Or you can go to your state. You can go to California or Massachusetts, and you'll see a little tab that says employment guide, and that's really to me, that's the Bible of the state. You use that employment guide, and that will answer any question you have around employment issues in your state, also federal law, any city law. And then if there's a document that goes along with it, let's say it's a separation release agreement, you're terminating somebody and you want them to sign a release, you will see a link in the guide to that document. Next question, in California, is travel time factored into the overtime pay? It needs to be. So your travel time must be included in the overtime, right? So if you pay travel time at a different rate than the service hours, you put all that money into a bucket, into one, one sum, divide that by the total hours worked, and then every overtime hour is paid at an additional half rate on top of it. So you would include that. Does Jersey require travel and mileage? I'm not sure about mileage, but it would require travel time between visits because that's a federal law. So every state requires you to pay travel between 2 visits in a single day. All right, let's do one more. Okay, this is a good one. Can I email out an updated employee handbook to all my employees after the changes you are recommending? Generally, you can. So what we recommend, update your handbook every single year. It's required. You need to do it. The laws are changing every year. And when somebody's hired, you have them sign the acknowledgement, right, of the existing handbook. And then it's good to get a receipt from them, like if they can respond by email saying, received the new handbook, email will work just fine. There are certain documents, though, like that arbitration program, where you really should have the arbitration program signed and in writing, and I would even save an electronic copy of it because it's so valuable. We sometimes see where somebody's got an arbitration program, but unfortunately they can't produce the arbitration agreement for a particular employee. They can't find it. Sometimes the employee takes it. We had that with an HR person who actually took her own arbitration agreement out of her personnel file that she had access to before she left. And then guess what she did? That's right, she brought a lawsuit. So have an electronic version, and it's not a requirement that arbitration is signed, but it should be a standalone agreement, and that is definitely a best practice. And if you can't get it signed, then provide it to somebody and note when you gave it to them. Have somebody else sign that they received it. Okay, I think we should probably stop there just to give everybody the respect of keeping on the time. We really, really appreciate you, Julio, Care Time, Ally Care Time. Thank you for hosting this and this series. Come back to us all. And if you want to do a survey here and tell us what else you want to hear about that might not be in the series, we always are looking for good feedback so we can understand what you need to hear. I saw a lot of live-in on the pre-registered questions, so we are going to do a very comprehensive review of live-in the next time we're together. Thank you.
Thank you.
This concludes today's webinar. If your question was not answered during the webinar, our speakers will attempt to reach out to you on a one-on-one basis. A recorded version of the presentation will be available on the Polsinelli website within 48 hours. Thank you for attending.